The Wild West you saw in Hollywood is a carefully constructed lie. We've been fed a century of cinematic fairy tales, clean duels, honorable outlaws, and heroic lawmen in white hats. But behind the Technicolor myth lies a reality of rotting teeth, chaotic violence, and a desperate struggle for survival that Hollywood didn't want you to see. The American frontier was nothing like the Ponderosa, and the heroism of the Lone Ranger wouldn't have survived a single afternoon in a real Nevada mining camp. Forget the movies, this is the West that actually was. Before we ride into the dust, a quick reminder, only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you end up enjoying this journey and want to uncover more lost history, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind. The Gilded Ghost of the Frontier. Everything you think you know about the American West is a fabrication, a meticulously crafted lie designed to sell popcorn, promote national pride, and provide a clean moral compass for a country still reeling from the scars of a civil war. We've been conditioned by a century of cinema to see the frontier through the lens of Bonanza. We see the Ponderosa Ranch, a sprawling, stable paradise where Ben Cartwright's shirts are always pressed, the family dinner is always served on time, and every moral dilemma is resolved with a wise patriarchal speech by the end of the hour. But the Ponderosa was a 1950s suburb with more horses. The real West was a horror show. Think of the image burned into your brain by the Lone Ranger, a masked hero on a pristine white horse named Silver, firing silver bullets that somehow always disarm the villain without spilling a drop of blood. It's a world of clear-cut destiny and silver-plated justice. It's clean, it's honorable, it's total fiction. If you were actually standing on the street of a frontier town like Dodge City or Tombstone in 1875, the first thing that would hit you wouldn't be the spirit of adventure, it would be the stench. Unlike the Cartwrights' pristine ranch, the real West was a landscape of gray mud, stagnant water, and the copper tang of red blood. You'd be breathing in a cocktail of rotting horse carcasses, open latrines, and the sour, unwashed wool of men who haven't seen a bar of soap in 3 months. In Bonanza, the wild was just a backdrop for family values. In reality, the wild was trying to kill you every second. There were no wise fathers to solve your problems. There was only the prairie madness, the sound of a woman screaming at the wind because she hadn't seen another human face in 6 months. The West wasn't a land of moral clarity. It was a desperate grayscale struggle for survival. The heroes weren't guardians of the peace like the Lone Ranger. They were often more sociopathic, more violent, and more opportunistic than the villains they hunted. If you were in a real frontier town, you wouldn't be watching a cinematic showdown. You'd be watching a man die slowly and agonizingly from an infected tooth because the local doctor was actually a failed blacksmith who used the same rusty pliers for pulling nails and pulling molars. But the frontier isn't the only place where the truth has been buried under a century of myths. If you want us to pull back the curtain on other eras, legends, or forgotten chapters of history beyond the Wild West, make a comment below. We're building a library of the truth here, and your input decides where we go next. If the lives weren't clean and the heroes weren't noble, what exactly did the violence of the West look like? To understand the real chaos of the frontier, we have to look past the silver bullets and into the clumsy, smoke-filled reality of the street fight. The Ballad of the Dirty, Clumsy Gunfight. Let's talk about the quick draw. It is the holy grail of Western cinema, the ultimate test of manhood. We've all seen the Lone Ranger do it. He draws with impossible speed, and with a single silver bullet, he shoots the gun out of the outlaw's hand. No blood, no mess, just perfect justice. In the real West, if you tried to shoot a gun out of someone's hand, you'd probably end up dead, and the outlaw would be laughing while they buried you. Hollywood-style quick draws in a real 19th century saloon were a recipe for disaster. You'd likely shoot your own toe off, snag your hammer on your coat lining, or find your weapon jammed in a holster that was never designed for speed. Real gunfights were rare, and when they happened, they were pathetic, chaotic scrambles. Most men couldn't hit a barn door from 20 feet away. Why? Because the equipment was garbage. The Lone Ranger's silver bullets were a literal waste of money. Silver is softer than lead, it would foul the barrel, mushroom poorly, and was incredibly expensive. Real frontiersmen used cheap, lead-cast rounds and black powder that was filthy. Hollywood never shows you the smoke. In the movies, the air stays clear so the camera can catch the hero's dramatic expression. In the real 1870s, the moment you pulled the trigger, a literal wall of thick, acrid, sulfurous white smoke would erupt from the barrel, hanging in the air like a fog bank. After the first shot, you couldn't see your opponent. You were just firing blindly into a white cloud, coughing on the fumes, and hoping your cheap, mass-produced revolver hadn't just jammed for the third time today. And then there's the myth of fanning the hammer. You've seen the Cartwright boys do it on Bonanza to take down a group of raiders. In the real West, fanning was a great way to break the internal springs of your gun and ensure you didn't hit anything within a mile of your target. It was a circus trick, not a combat tactic. Take the most famous shootout in history, the OK Corral. Hollywood portrays it as a choreographed masterpiece. In reality, it lasted about 30 seconds. Roughly 30 shots were fired at point-blank range. We're talking 5 to 10 feet apart, and the vast majority of them missed completely. It was a messy, frantic execution in a narrow, horse manure-caked alleyway. If you knew a fight was coming, you didn't wait for a fair draw like a hero in a white hat. There was no code of the West protecting your honor. You hid behind a rain barrel and shot your opponent in the back while he was mounting his horse. You stepped out from a dark doorway with a double-barreled shotgun loaded with buckshot because you didn't want a contest, you wanted to kill. The showdown, as we know it, was actually an evolution of the street fight. There was no high noon. There was only the dark alley, the shotgun hidden under a heavy coat, and the desperate prayer that your powder hadn't gotten damp from the morning fog. Victory didn't go to the fastest man. It went to the man who was willing to cheat, ambush, and kill without hesitation. But while the guns were loud and the fights were clumsy, the men holding them were often far more complex and far more corrupt than the silver screen legends suggest. To understand the real West, we have to look at the men behind the badges. The hero's mask, the lawman, and the outlaw delusion. In the world of the Lone Ranger, the badge is a sacred symbol. It's a shield of absolute morality that never rusts and never fails. When you see the Ranger or the Cartwright family on Bonanza, they represent an unwavering commitment to the code of the West. They are the thin line between civilization and chaos, and they never, ever have a hidden agenda. But in the real West, the badge wasn't a symbol of justice. It was a business license. The line between a lawman and an outlaw wasn't a canyon. It was a vibrating thread that men crossed back and forth every single day. The most legendary figures of the frontier, men like Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, and Bat Masterson, spent more time in the wanted section of the newspaper than they did on the payroll of a city council. These weren't pillars of the community. They were gamblers, saloon keepers, pimps, and enforcers who pinned on a star because it gave them a legal permit to kill their business rivals. Take Wyatt Earp. Hollywood portrays him as the ultimate guardian of Tombstone. But before Wyatt ever walked into the OK Corral, he had a rap sheet that would make a modern criminal blush. In 1871, he was arrested in Van Buren, Arkansas, for horse theft, a hanging offense. A few years later, in Peoria, Illinois, he was arrested multiple times for his involvement in unseemly houses, frontier code for brothels. When the Earp brothers arrived in Tombstone, they weren't there to clean up the town. They were there to build an empire. They wanted control of the gambling concessions and the liquor trades. Their enemies, the cowboys, were essentially a rival gang of ranchers who refused to pay the Earps for protection. The Lone Ranger never took a bribe. Wyatt Earp never passed one up. Even Wild Bill Hickok, the man supposedly so fast he could shoot the spots off a playing card, was a tragic, broken figure. He was a chronic gambler who spent his final days in Deadwood with failing eyesight from glaucoma, terrified that someone would sneak up behind him. His legendary dead man's hand, aces and eights, wasn't a heroic symbol. It was the final result of a life spent in dark rooms, looking for a way to pay off his debts. Hickok even accidentally shot and killed his own deputy, Mike Williams, in a chaotic street fight in Abilene because he was so jumpy and paranoid. Then there were the Pinkertons. In movies, they are the elite detectives. In reality, they were a private corporate army. If a railroad company or a cattle baron wanted a small farmer off their land, they didn't call a judge, they called the Pinkertons. These men were responsible for some of the most brutal violence in Western history, including the firebombing of the James Younger family home that resulted in the death of a young boy and the loss of Jesse James's mother's arm. If this deep dive into the dark side of frontier justice is hitting home, let me know in the comments. Which hero from the old shows do you want me to deconstruct next? The justice of the West wasn't found in a courtroom. It was found in the pockets of the men who could afford to hire the most guns. And while the lawmen were busy playing both sides of the badge, the real backbone of the West was being broken in the mud of the cattle trails. The meat grinder. The industrial horror of the trail. When you watch Bonanza, the Cartwrights ride across the Ponderosa with a soaring orchestral score playing in the background. Their horses are perfectly groomed, their hats are never dusty, and the trail is a place of scenic beauty and moral lessons. In reality, the cattle trail was a 4-month-long exercise in physical and psychological misery that would have broken little Joe Cartwright in 48 hours. The cowboy was not the rugged, independent adventurer Hollywood loves. He was a seasonal migrant worker at the absolute bottom of the social ladder. Most cowboys were young, desperate men, many of them black or Mexican, who were paid a pittance to move thousands of pounds of living, breathing meat across an unforgiving landscape. These weren't men seeking freedom. They were men seeking a paycheck in an era that offered few other options. Imagine your day starts at 4 a.m. There is no sunrise yet, only a freezing, damp darkness. Your bed is a single lice-infested blanket on the hard earth, often crawling with ticks or centipedes that have found warmth against your body. You haven't changed your clothes in 6 weeks. Your skin is a map of raw, weeping saddle sores on your inner thighs that never heal because the friction of the ride reopens them every single morning. The Lone Ranger rode a pristine white stallion named Silver. The real cowboy rode a remuda, a pool of half-broken, ill-tempered nags that were essentially disposable tools. You'd grab a cup of Arbuckles' coffee, a brew so bitter and acidic it was said to float a horseshoe, and a piece of hardtack so rock hard you had to soak it in grease or coffee just to keep from shattering your teeth. If you were a new hand or a minority rider, you were assigned to the drag. This was the absolute lowest point of frontier existence. You rode at the very back of 3,000 terrified, defecating cattle. This meant you spent 16 hours a day in a permanent choking cloud of thick, alkaline dust and pulverized manure. This dust didn't just coat your skin, it filled your lungs. It turned your spit into gray mud and caused dust pneumonia, a condition where your lungs would literally fill with fluid and grit, leaving men coughing up black phlegm for months after the drive ended. There was no glamour in the drag. There was only the slow, rhythmic sound of 1,000-pound animals and the constant struggle to breathe. And then there was the stampede. Hollywood makes them look exciting, a dramatic moment for the hero to shine. In reality, they were a terrifying psychological trauma. One crack of thunder, a sudden movement at 2 a.m., or even the smell of a predator could turn 3,000 longhorns into a mindless wall of 3 million pounds of muscle and horn. In a stampede, the cattle don't run around you, they run through you. You would be riding at a full gallop in total darkness, unable to see the ground, praying to God that your horse didn't step in a badger hole or slip on wet grass. If it did, you were dead. There was no dramatic funeral, no wise speech from Ben Cartwright. You were simply trampled into the prairie mud until you were unrecognizable. Your brothers of the trail would keep moving because the cattle were a corporate asset, and you were a replaceable part. Drop a cowboy in the comments if you think you'd have lasted more than a week in those conditions. When the drive finally reached a cow town like Abilene or Dodge City, the cowboy didn't go to a fancy hotel. He went to the district. He spent his entire 4 months' pay, roughly $30 to $40, in 48 hours. He bought a bath to scrape off the layers of trail grime, a new pair of boots to replace the ones that had rotted off his feet, and enough rot-gut whiskey to forget the smell of the drag. The freedom of the trail was a myth manufactured by novelists. You were a cog in a massive, industrial machine designed to turn grass into gold for the beef syndicates in Chicago. The West wasn't won by bravery. It was processed by the pound, fueled by the blood and sweat of men who were often forgotten before their bodies were even cold. The trail was a meat grinder, but at the end of it sat the real masters of the frontier, not the men with the guns, but the men with the ledgers. To see who really owned the West, we have to look past the dust and into the boardrooms. The corporate frontier, the railroad, and the monopoly. In the world of Bonanza, the Cartwrights are the masters of their own destiny. They own the Ponderosa, a vast kingdom of timber and cattle, and their only real struggle is defending their borders from the occasional land grabber or outlaw. It's a story of rugged individualism, where a man's word and his Winchester are enough to hold a piece of the American dream. But while Ben Cartwright was busy worrying about his family's honor, the real West was being swallowed whole by men in velvet-lined offices in New York and London. The movies show you a lone rider on a horse, a symbol of ultimate freedom. They don't show you the ledgers and the boardrooms where the West was actually owned. The real Wild West wasn't a land of rugged individuals. It was the birthplace of the modern American monopoly. The Transcontinental Railroad wasn't just a feat of engineering that connected the coasts. It was a massive, government-subsidized land grab that made the Cartwrights' Ponderosa look like a garden plot. For every mile of track laid, the government gave railroad companies up to 20 square miles of public land that had been home to indigenous nations for millennia. These companies became the ultimate dictators of the frontier. If you were a small-time homesteader in Nebraska or Wyoming, the railroad decided if your family lived or died. They set the freight prices. If you didn't pay their exorbitant rates, your grain rotted in the sun and your cattle died in the pens. You didn't own your life, you leased it from the Union Pacific or the Central Pacific. This corporate stranglehold led to the real range wars. Hollywood portrays these as cinematic battles between civilized farmers and wild cattlemen. In reality, they were brutal, corporate-funded skirmishes where hired mercenaries burned down the homes of families to protect the profit margins of industrial cattle syndicates. Look at the Johnson County War of 1892. This wasn't a noble defense of a ranch like you'd see in the Lone Ranger. This was a literal invasion. A group of wealthy cattle barons, the Association, felt that small-time homesteaders were stealing their grass. So, they didn't call the sheriff. They didn't go to a judge. They hired a private army of 50 invaders, professional killers and former Pinkerton agents, and sent them into the county on a secret train with a hit list of names. They weren't there to bring law and order. They were there to execute competition. They besieged a cabin, burned 2 men alive as they fled the flames, and were only stopped when a local posse of over 200 terrified but furious citizens surrounded them. Even then, the system worked for the corporations. The U.S. cavalry rode in to rescue the invaders, and not a single cattle baron ever spent a night in a prison cell for the murders they funded. This is what West Hollywood didn't want you to see. Not a land of heroes, but a land of debt. If you were a miner in Nevada or a ranch hand in Texas, you weren't a free man. You were likely living in a company town. You lived in a house owned by the company. You ate food bought from the company store on credit, and you were paid in scrip, fake money that was only good at the company's businesses. You were an industrial serf. The Lone Ranger's silver bullets were paid for with a salary. The real frontiersman was lucky if his salary covered his debt to the boss. Then came the barbed wire apocalypse. In 1874, a man named Joseph Glidden patented a simple twisted wire with sharp points. In the movies, the open range is a symbol of endless possibility. In reality, barbed wire was the death of the West. It sliced the landscape into private blocks, ending the era of the free-roaming cowboy and turning the frontier into a series of fenced-in outdoor factories. The Wild West ended not with a shootout, but with a fence and a contract. The rugged individual found himself fenced in, taxed, and owned by entities thousands of miles away. While Bonanza told us that land was something you died for, history tells us it was something you were swindled out of by a corporation that had more lawyers than the Cartwrights had horses. The frontier wasn't settled by the brave, it was swallowed by the wealthy. And as the corporate machines chewed up the land, the people left behind were forced to endure a physical reality that would have made the Lone Ranger's adventures look like a vacation. The corporate frontier didn't just take the land, it neglected the people on it. When the corporate-owned cities failed to provide safety, the human body paid the price in ways the silver screen could never show. The surgeon saw medicine as a horror movie. In the world of the Lone Ranger, a gunshot wound is a minor inconvenience. The hero might clutch his arm, a bit of dramatic music plays, and in the next scene he's wearing a clean white bandage over his sleeve, ready to ride. In Bonanza, Dr. Martin arrives with a polished black bag, dispenses some wise advice, and the Cartwright boys are back to full strength by dinner. But in the real Wild West, there was no such thing as a clean flesh wound. Every bullet was a death sentence waiting to happen. If you were shot in 1875, you weren't dealing with modern jacketed ammunition. You were hit by a heavy .45 caliber slug made of soft lead. When that soft lead hit a human body, it didn't just pass through, it mushroomed. It expanded into a jagged, irregular mass that didn't just pierce muscle, it pulverized it. If it hit a bone, it didn't just break it, it shattered it into 1,000 tiny daggers of calcium that stayed embedded in your tissue. And here's the part Hollywood never shows, the clothing. A bullet doesn't enter the body alone. It drags pieces of your sweat-soaked, manure-dusted wool shirt and your dirt-caked leather vest deep into the wound. There were no antibiotics. There was no sterile environment. You were a walking petri dish of frontier bacteria. The Lone Ranger had silver bullets, but the real West had lead-poisoned water and doctors who thought a dirty apron was a badge of experience. Imagine you're lying on a wooden table in the back of a general store. The doctor, who might have been a barber or a failed veterinarian the week before, doesn't wash his hands. Why would he? Germ theory was still a fancy Eastern idea that hadn't reached the dusty streets of Tombstone. He reaches for a bone saw that still has the dried blood of the man he treated 2 hours ago. There is no anesthesia, no morphine, no ether. Your only comfort is a pint of rotgut, whiskey, a toxic brew of raw grain alcohol and tobacco juice, and a piece of leather to bite down on so you don't swallow your own tongue from the pain. The doctor's goal wasn't to save your limb, it was to cut it off as fast as humanly possible. A good surgeon could take a leg off at the hip in under 2 minutes. They had to be fast, because if they didn't finish quickly, the shock would kill you before the blood loss did. And if you survived the saw, then came the real killer, the gangrene. In Hollywood, the wound heals cleanly. In reality, the wound would turn black. It would start to smell like rotting garbage. This was hospital fever, and it stalked every frontier town. If the infection reached your bloodstream, you were dead within days. Doctors would try to burn the infection out with cauterizing irons or pack the wound with poultices made of cow dung and moldy bread. Sometimes they'd even use leeches to draw out the bad blood, essentially draining the last bit of strength from a dying man. Even the simple act of a toothache was a descent into hell. There were no dentists. If you had a rotted molar, you went to the blacksmith. He'd use the same heavy iron pliers he used to pull nails out of horse hooves. He'd place a knee on your chest for leverage and pull until something gave way, either the tooth or your jawbone. This is why you see so few smiles in old frontier photos. It wasn't just Western stoicism. It was because their mouths were graveyards of jagged stumps and receding gums. In the movies, the doctor is a healer. In the real West, the doctor was often just a man with a saw and a very high tolerance for screaming. This is the visceral, terrifying reality that Bonanza sanitized for a 1950s audience. They gave us the grand old West where pain was temporary and justice was clean. But the real West was a place where a single rusty nail or a stray splinter could end your life in a week of feverish agony. But as much as the physical body suffered, the human mind was under an even greater assault. Because once you survived the surgeon's table, you had to face the most terrifying force on the frontier, the absolute crushing weight of the silence. We've seen the corporate greed and the physical horror, but to truly understand why the West was nothing like the Ponderosa, we have to look at the people Hollywood tried to delete from the map entirely. The invisible women beyond the saloon girl. When you watch an episode of Bonanza, the women are secondary colors on a primary colored canvas. They are the schoolmarm with perfectly coiffed hair, the helpless widow waiting for a Cartwright to pay her mortgage, or the saloon girl with a feather in her hair and a witty line of dialogue. In the world of the Lone Ranger, women are damsels in distress, set pieces to be rescued and then forgotten by the time the credits roll, and then forgotten by the time the credits roll. But history tells a story of female titans who didn't just survive the West, they ran it while the men were busy shooting each other over 3-cent poker pots. In the real 19th century West, the rigid Victorian social structures of the East didn't just bend, they shattered. Because the environment was so hostile, your value wasn't determined by your gender, it was determined by your utility. If a woman could hold a plow, manage a herd, or defend a claim, no one cared if she wore pants or swore like a sailor. The West was a legal loophole where a woman could own property, run a business, and wield genuine power in a way that was unthinkable in Philadelphia or New York. The soap and water economy. Hollywood never shows you the soap and water economy, but in mining towns, the women who washed the clothes were the real financial heavyweights. A man might spend 14 hours a day in a dark, oxygen-deprived hole in the earth and come up with nothing but a cough. A laundress, however, was guaranteed a steady stream of income from 500 men who hadn't seen a bar of soap in a month. These women became the primary creditors of the frontier. Because they were the only ones with a consistent daily cash flow, they often lent money at high interest to the very miners and businessmen who looked down on them. In places like Virginia City, a laundress could earn more in a week than a silver miner earned in a month. They were the silent bankers of the Wild West, and they didn't need a mask or a silver bullet to command respect. They just needed a washboard and a ledger. The myth of the glamorous madam. Then there was the dark reality of the saloon girl. Hollywood portrays the madam as a glamorous figure in velvet, like Miss Kitty from Gunsmoke. In reality, most of these women were trapped in a cycle of poverty and disease that would have horrified the Cartwrights. They worked in cribs, tiny, unheated, one-room shacks barely large enough for a bed, lined up in back alleys. They were the shock absorbers of frontier trauma, dealing with drunken violence, the constant threat of smallpox, and the physical toll of a life with no social safety net. Their earnings mostly went back to the saloon owner for protection and rent. It wasn't a life of witty banter, it was a life of survival in the coldest, darkest corners of the boomtowns. Stagecoach Mary, the legend Hollywood ignored. But out of this darkness rose figures like Stagecoach Mary Fields. Born into slavery, Mary moved west and became a legend in Cascade, Montana. She was 6 feet tall, weighed over 200 pounds, and was the first black woman to work for the U.S. Postal Service as a star route carrier. The Lone Ranger rode a horse named Silver. Stagecoach Mary drove a team of 6 horses and a mule named Moses. She carried a .38 Smith & Wesson under her apron and a 10-inch Bowie knife on her hip. She was known to knock men unconscious with a single punch if they insulted her, and she never missed a delivery. If the snow was too deep for the horses, she'd put on snowshoes and carry the mail on her back. She didn't need a masked ranger to protect her. She was the one the bandits were afraid of. She was a cigar-smoking, hard-drinking, legendary pioneer who proved that the weaker sex was a concept that didn't survive the crossing of the Mississippi, the architectural horror of the sod house. For the women on the homesteads, the battle wasn't against outlaws. It was against the great silence in the very earth they lived in. Imagine living in a house made of dirt, the soddy. These weren't the cozy log cabins of Bonanza. They were blocks of prairie grass and mud stacked into walls. The ceiling was a living ecosystem. In the summer, snakes, mice, and giant centipedes would burrow through the dirt and fall onto your bed or into your soup. When the rains came, the roof would liquefy. For days after a storm, the ceiling would drip mud into your flour, your clothes, and your baby's cradle. There was no way to keep a soddy clean. It was a constant losing battle against the encroaching earth. Prairie madness. The isolation was so extreme that women would go months without seeing another female face. This led to a documented psychological phenomenon known as prairie madness. The sound of the wind across the grass became a physical weight, a high-pitched, never-ending scream. The wind is a person. It talks, it whispers, and then it howls until you can't hear your own thoughts. Diaries from the era are filled with the harrowing accounts of women who slowly lost their grip on reality. Some would simply stop speaking. Others would walk out into the waist-high tall grass and disappear forever, unable to face another day of the wind and the dirt. Hollywood shows the pioneer woman with a hopeful gaze toward the horizon. History shows her staring at that same horizon, praying for a single human voice to break the terrifying silence of the plains. The Wild West wasn't just a place of action. It was a place of profound psychological endurance. While the men were off chasing gold or fame, the women were holding the line against insanity and starvation in houses made of mud. Does this change how you see the damsels in those old shows? Let me know in the comments. We're digging deeper into the group's Hollywood erased next. The Chinatown War, the forgotten industrial bloodbath. If you watch a classic Western, you'd think the frontier was a white wilderness, a vast empty space waiting for the European pioneers to bring order to the chaos. Hollywood painted the West in shades of John Wayne, a monolithic story of Anglo-Saxon triumph. But the real West was a global industrial machine, fueled by a demographic mosaic that Hollywood spent a century trying to bleach out of the record. By the 1870s, Chinese immigrants weren't just a supporting cast. They were the industrial heart of the West. They built the railroads that connected the Cartwright's Ponderosa to the rest of the world. They were the ones carving tunnels through the solid granite of the Sierras, working with unstable nitroglycerin that turned human bodies into red mist for the sake of a corporate timeline. They were the most efficient, organized, and resilient workforce on the continent. And because they were efficient, they were marked for death. Hollywood loves the image of the outlaw, but they ignore the anti-coolie, clubs, and the working man's party. This wasn't wild lawlessness. It was a calculated, racialized purge driven by economic envy. When white miners and laborers couldn't compete with the Chinese work ethic, they didn't look for justice. They looked for ropes. In 1871, the city of Los Angeles, long before it was the capital of glamour, was the site of a massacre that would have made the shootout at the OK Corral look like a playground scuffle. A mob of 500 white and Latino men, fueled by rumors that Rodgut whiskey descended on Chinatown. They didn't come for a fair fight. They came for an ethnic cleansing. Imagine the scene. No music, no heroic rescues, just the sound of boots on dirt and the smell of kerosene. The mob dragged 19 Chinese men and boys from their homes, including a respected local doctor who offered his gold to be spared. They didn't listen. They hanged them from wagons, from awnings, and from the crossbeams of a local carriage shop. By the time the sun went down, Chinatown was a graveyard. Only one man was ever convicted of manslaughter for the massacre, and his conviction was overturned a year later. This is the frontier justice that the Lone Ranger completely ignores. The real West wasn't a battle between law and lawlessness. It was a battle of the majority against the minority, where the law was often the one holding the torch. In Rock Springs, Wyoming, in 1885, white miners armed with Winchesters opened fire on Chinese laborers in broad daylight. They burned 78 homes to the ground while the residents were still inside. The survivors fled into the desert, where many died of exposure. The U.S. government's response: they didn't arrest the murderers. They passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first law in American history to ban an entire ethnic group, effectively saying, if we can't kill you all, we'll just make it illegal for you to exist here. The Wild West wasn't won by a man in a white hat. It was cleared by a mob in a frenzy, and then sanitized by a studio in California. If you look at the real photos from that era, you don't see the empty West. You see a landscape of global collision. You see Mexican vaqueros who invented the very tools the American cowboys stole. You see black regiments, the Buffalo Soldiers, sent to the harshest frontiers to fight wars for a country that still wouldn't let them sit at the same table. And you see Chinese laborers whose sweat is quite literally the glue that held the Transcontinental Railroad together. Drop a comment if you think these stories deserve their own movie. It's time we stop looking at the West through Hollywood's narrow lens and start seeing the full, brutal picture. But as the blood dried in the streets of Chinatown, a different kind of violence was taking place in the boardrooms and on the open range. A violence not of the mob, but of the machine. We've seen the erasure of people, but now we must look at the erasure of the land itself. Because the Old West didn't just fade away, it was industrialized into a graveyard. The vigilante's rope. Justice by the mob. In the world of the Lone Ranger, the vigilante is a rare and noble figure. He is the lone hero who steps in when the law is too weak or too corrupt to act. He operates by a strict moral code, ensuring that the innocent are protected and only the guilty face the consequences. Even in Bonanza, when the Cartwrights take the law into their own hands, it's portrayed as a reluctant, heavy-hearted necessity to protect their land and their legacy. It's frontier justice, but it's still justice, clean, purposeful, and righteous. But in the real Wild West, vigilante justice wasn't a noble last resort. It was a calculated tool of the ruling class used to liquidate political rivals and protect corporate interests. The images Hollywood sold us, the angry but ultimately fair mob, are a shadow of a much darker reality. Most vigilance committees weren't groups of concerned citizens pushed to the brink. They were organized, paramilitary wings of the town's wealthiest elite. They didn't target the bad guys to save the community. They targeted anyone who stood in the way of their economic or political stranglehold. Take the San Francisco Committee of Vigilance. In the movies, San Francisco is often a lawless gold rush town saved by brave men with stars. In reality, the Committee of 1856 was a merchant-led coup d'etat. They didn't just help the law, they overthrew it. They raised a private army of 6,000 armed men, seized control of the city's armory, and built a massive fortified headquarters protected by sandbags and cannons. They called it Fort Gunnybags. From this fortress, the city's wealthiest merchants bypassed the courts entirely. They conducted trials behind closed doors where the accused had no lawyers and no right to face their accusers. They didn't just hang common thieves, they targeted Irish immigrants and members of the rival political party. They were essentially a board of directors with the power to execute. While the Lone Ranger was fighting for the American way, the San Francisco vigilantes were busy making sure the American way only applied to the people who owned the banks. The Lone Ranger never hanged an innocent man. The vigilance committees did it as a matter of policy. Imagine the theatricality of a real vigilante hanging. It wasn't the quick, dramatic drop you see on screen. It was often a slow, agonizing process of strangulation in front of a cheering crowd of thousands. These weren't somber affairs, they were public spectacles, often fueled by the same rot-gut whiskey we discussed earlier. In 1851, in the town of Downeyville, a mob of hundreds dragged a woman named Juanita to a bridge and hanged her because she had killed a man in self-defense. There was no ranger to ride in at the last second to stop the rope. There was only the mob, the cheers, and the cold reality of a life ended for the convenience of a committee. Even the legendary Lincoln County War, the conflict that gave us Billy the Kid, wasn't a battle of outlaws versus the law. It was a turf war between two rival dry goods monopolies. The regulators, whom Hollywood loves to paint as heroic freedom fighters, were actually hired guns for one faction, while the sheriff was a hired gun for the other. Both sides called themselves the law when it suited them, and both sides acted as vigilantes when it didn't. Billy the Kid wasn't a misunderstood hero like Little Joe Cartwright. He was a teenage soldier in a corporate merger that used lead instead of ink. This was the true code of the West. The law was a weapon, and whoever had the most money got to pull the trigger. The rope wasn't about right or wrong. It was about who owned the land, who controlled the water, and who could afford to hire the most men to stand on the street corner at noon. But while the mobs were busy hanging people in the streets, the rugged individuals Hollywood loves so much were facing a psychological breakdown that no silver screen hero could ever overcome. Because once you survived the mob and the corporate monopolies, you were left with the most terrifying force of all, the absolute crushing weight of the Great Silence. We've seen the violence of the mob, but now we must look at the violence of the mind. Because the wild in the West wasn't just in the people, it was in the very atmosphere of the land itself. The invention of the myth, Buffalo Bill's PR machine. How did we get here? How did a world defined by industrial grime, chronic dysentery, and corporate monopolies turn into a golden-hued legend of rugged honor and sun-drenched heroism? The answer isn't found in a history book or a dusty archive. It was manufactured under a circus tent by the greatest PR architect of the 19th century, William Buffalo Bill Cody. The Wild West as you know it didn't emerge from the dirt of the frontier. It was a high-gloss product designed to sell tickets. The American frontier was never as clean as the Ponderosa, and its heroes were never as bloodless as the Lone Ranger. Cody just made sure you believed they were. By 1883, the real West was already in its death throes. The railroads had won, the tribes had been largely forced onto reservations, and the open range was being strangled by thousands of miles of barbed wire. But Buffalo Bill realized that the American public and a fascinated Europe didn't want the truth about the cholera outbreaks or the failed homesteads. They wanted a story. They wanted a moral crusade. The architect of the lie, Cody himself, was a man of the transition. He had been a real scout, a real buffalo hunter, and a real Medal of Honor recipient. But he possessed a genius that Wyatt Earp or Wild Bill Hickok lacked. He understood the power of branding. He realized that the dirty, desperate reality of the West was a commodity. In his Wild West show, he didn't just reenact history, he edited it in real time. He didn't just hire actors, he hired the real legends. He brought in Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa Lakota leader who had helped defeat Custer at the Little Bighorn. But in Cody's arena, Sitting Bull wasn't a leader, he was a prop. He was paid to ride around a dirt circle while white audiences hissed and booed at him. He was the savage in a carefully scripted morality play, helping to validate the narrative that the civilized white man's victory was both inevitable and righteous. This was the birth of the Indian trope that would plague cinema for a century, a caricature designed for white comfort, the uniform of a ghost. Cody was the reason the Lone Ranger looks the way he does. Before the Wild West show, cowboys wore whatever was cheap and practical, often old Union or Confederate uniforms, bowler hats, or simple wool caps. Cody gave them the flashy fringes, the silver-studded belts, and the iconic Stetson. He took a group of low-paid seasonal workers, men who smelled of cow manure and cheap whiskey, and rebranded them as the Knights of the Plains. The Lone Ranger wore a mask to hide his identity. Buffalo Bill wore a costume to hide the truth. He popularized the Custer's Last Stand reenactment, turning a catastrophic military failure caused by ego and poor planning into a symbol of ultimate sacrifice and American grit. He turned a massacre into a myth. Every time a kid today puts on a toy cowboy hat or pretends to draw a gun, they aren't mimicking history, they are mimicking Historicus, performer from 1885. Global export, the world's version of America. Cody didn't stop at the American border. He took his show to London for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee and across continental Europe. He taught the world that the American West was a place of constant action, sharpshooting, and moral clarity. By the time the show ended its run, the global image of the American was inextricably linked to the cowboy. When the first film cameras began to roll at the turn of the century, the directors didn't look at historical records. They looked at Cody's stage. They hired his performers. They bought his costumes. Hollywood didn't invent the Western, they just inherited Buffalo Bill's script and gave it a larger audience. This is the direct lineage of Bonanza and the Lone Ranger. They are descendants of the 1870s. They are descendants of Cody's 1880s marketing campaign. They sold a version of the West where the bad guys were always caught, the families were always intact, and the dust never actually got into your lungs. But while Cody was building his circus, the government was attempting a military experiment so bizarre it sounds like a fever dream, a plan to conquer the desert that Hollywood completely deleted because a camel didn't look as heroic as a white horse. We've seen how the myth was packaged, but now we must look at the experiments that failed too spectacularly for the movies to acknowledge. Because before the horse was the undisputed king of the West, the army had a different animal in mind, the Sahara of America, the great camel experiment. In the world of Bonanza, the horse is a noble companion, almost a member of the family. Whether it's Adam's sleek stallion or Little Joe's spirited pinto, the horse is the undisputed king of the frontier. Even Hollywood writers realized that sometimes the landscape was too harsh for a stallion, but instead of showing the gritty failure of history, they turned it into a quirky plot device. There's an episode of Bonanza titled The Camel's Step, where a camel is treated like a bizarre, temperamental guest, a bit of trivia to break up the ranch drama. But in the real West, the Great Camel Experiment wasn't a joke or a one-off adventure. It was a massive $30,000 military gamble that should have changed the face of America. By 1855, the Secretary of War, a man named Jefferson Davis, who would later become the President of the Confederacy, realized that American horses were dying in the southwestern heat. They couldn't carry the weight, they couldn't find enough water, and they were literally collapsing in the middle of the Arizona desert. Davis's solution was radical. He imported 77 camels from Egypt, Turkey, and Tunisia, convinced they were the ships of the desert that would allow the U.S. Army to conquer the frontier. Imagine you're a prospector in 1857. You look up at the heat-blurred horizon, and instead of the Lone Ranger on a white stallion, you see a U.S. soldier perched atop a dromedary camel, swaying through a landscape that looks more like the Sahara than the Ponderosa. For a few years, it actually worked. Under the command of Edward Fitzgerald Beale, the camels proved to be superhuman. They could carry 800 pounds of gear for 30 miles a day without needing a single drop of water. They even walked through snow and across rivers with a stoicism that shamed the Army's mules. So why don't we see the Lone Ranger riding a camel named Silver? Because the experiment was killed by the two things Hollywood hates most, human ego and the Civil War. The American soldiers hated the camels. The animals smelled like rotting vegetation. They were prone to sudden, violent biting, and, most importantly, they terrified the horses. A single camel walking into a cavalry camp would trigger a stampede that could destroy a week's worth of supplies in 10 seconds. When the Civil War broke out, the Camel Corps was abandoned. Its biggest supporters, like Davis, went south to join the Confederacy, and the Union simply didn't want anything to do with the Confederate project. The camels were sold off to circuses or simply turned loose into the wild. But the West didn't forget them. For decades, a terrifying legend haunted the Arizona frontier, the Red Ghost. Settlers reported seeing a massive reddish camel with a dead man, sometimes described as a bleached human skeleton, strapped to its back with rawhide. It was said to trample people and disappear into thin air. In 1893, a farmer finally shot it, only to find the camel's skin scarred by the very leather straps that had held a dying man's corpse in place for years. The Wild West of Hollywood was built on the back of the horse, but the real West is still haunted by the ghosts of the animals we were too stubborn to use. The hunger of the Sierras, the survival psychology of the Donner Party. In an episode of The Lone Ranger, the hero might get trapped in a blizzard, but he always finds a cave, builds a perfect fire, and survives with his partner Tonto, sharing a wise lesson about nature. In Bonanza, the Cartwrights face every hardship with family values. No matter how hungry they get, they never lose their humanity. But the real West was a place where family values dissolved in the frost. And the Donner Party is the ultimate proof that the American dream was often a marketing scam that ended in a graveyard. The disaster didn't start with snow, it started with a book. A man named Lansford Hastings wrote The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, promoting a shortcut that he claimed would shave 300 miles off the journey. The catch? Hastings hadn't actually traveled the entire route with a wagon. He was a salesman selling a fantasy, and the Donner Reed Party bought it. The party was led by George Donner, a charitable but inexperienced man, and James Reed, an autocratic leader whose aristocratic attitude rubbed the group the wrong way. When they reached the shortcut, they were warned by an experienced mountain man, Jim Kleiman, who told them the route was a death trap. But Reed was driven by land greed and a desperate need to beat the other wagon trains. The Lone Ranger always listens to the wise guide. James Reed listened to a guidebook. The shortcut turned out to be 125 miles longer than the established trail. It took them 5 days to cross the Great Salt Lake Desert instead of the promised 2. They lost dozens of cattle to thirst and were forced to abandon their heavy wagons. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada, they were late, very late. Then the snow fell, 5 feet in a single night, and it didn't stop for months. The psychological disintegration that followed was far more terrifying than the cannibalism. The group didn't just resort to eating each other, they social contracted themselves into a hierarchy of survival. They ate the ox hides off their roofs, they ate their dogs, and finally, they ate the dead. But Hollywood never mentions Luis and Salvador, two Miwok guides who had been sent from California with supplies to save the party. When the food ran out, the starving pioneers didn't just wait for the guides to die. They hunted them down and executed them for their meat. This wasn't a frontier tragedy. It was a cold-blooded murder born of a desperation that Bonanza would never dare to film. Out of 87 people, only 47 survived. One survivor, Virginia Reed, wrote a letter back home with a single haunting sentence that sums up the real West. Never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can. The Donner Party isn't a story of survival. It's a story of what happens when the myth of the easy West meets the reality of the meat grinder, the kangaroo court, lynch law, and vanished souls. In the world of the Lone Ranger, the law is a flawless machine. The ranger captures the outlaw, hands him over to a stern but fair sheriff, and the criminal is led away to a sturdy brick jail to await a trial presided over by a wise, white-haired judge. In Bonanza, even when tensions boil over in Virginia City, the rule of law is the ultimate North Star. There is a courtroom, there is a jury, and there is a sense that the truth will eventually prevail. But in the real Wild West, due process was a luxury frontier towns couldn't afford. Justice wasn't found in a law book, it was found at the bottom of a whiskey bottle and the end of a hemp rope. The reality was that most frontier settlements didn't have a jail. They didn't have a courthouse, and they certainly didn't have a budget to feed and house a criminal for 6 months while waiting for a circuit judge to ride into town. To the residents of a gold mining camp or a cattle town, a prisoner was a liability, a drain on resources, and a constant escape risk. So, they developed a system that was fast, cheap, and horrifyingly final, the miners' court. These weren't legal proceedings, they were drunken popularity contests, held in the center of a saloon. If you were accused of stealing a horse or salting a mine, the jury was whoever happened to be standing at the bar that afternoon. There were no defense attorneys, no rules of evidence, and no appeals. The judge was often just the man with the loudest voice or the biggest stake in the outcome. The Lone Ranger fought for truth and justice. The miners' court fought for convenience and revenge. For any crime deemed serious enough to disrupt the peace, the town had two primary solutions: the rope or the road. We've already talked about the rope, the public agonizing spectacle of the lynching. But Hollywood rarely shows you the psychological cruelty of the road. This was the practice of banishment. If the mob decided not to hang you, they would give you the road. They would strip you of your weapons, your horse, and your supplies, and force you to walk out of town into the wilderness. In the high desert of Nevada or the winter peaks of the Sierras, being given the road was a slow-motion execution. You were being cast out into a landscape that was actively trying to kill you, with nothing but the clothes on your back. But the mob wanted to make sure you never came back, and they wanted the next town to know exactly who you were. This led to the practice of branding. In some camps, if you were found guilty of theft, they wouldn't just banish you, they would use a hot iron to burn a letter into your cheek or forehead, T for thief. In other camps, they would use a knife to crop your ears. Imagine the Lone Ranger's reaction to a town that didn't just arrest criminals, but physically mutilated them so they could never again hide in a crowd. One of the most chilling examples of this, kangaroo justice, occurred in Downeyville, California in 1851. A woman named Juanita was living in a small cabin when a drunken miner broke in and attempted to assault her. In the struggle, Juanita stabbed the man in self-defense. In the world of Bonanza, the Cartwrights would have stood by her, explaining the nuances of self-defense to a reasonable jury. In the real West, a mob of 2,000 men dragged Juanita to a bridge over the Yuba River. They held a mock trial that lasted only a few hours. Despite the fact that she was clearly defending herself, the mob wanted blood to avenge their fellow miner. Juanita, showing more courage than any man in the mob, adjusted the noose around her own neck and told the crowd she had no regrets. She was the first woman lynched in California. There was no ranger to ride in at the last second. There was no silver galloping across the bridge. There was only the sound of the rope snapping and the cheers of a mob that called its bloodlust justice. But what happened when the rope wasn't enough? When the punishment was meant to be a permanent, living scar on the land itself? The West wasn't civilized by the law, It was terrified into submission by the mob. And that terror wasn't just directed at people, it was directed at the very foundation of the earth itself. As the corporate machines realized they could get away with literal murder in the streets, they turned their sights on the mountains. We've seen the violence of the mob, but now we must look at the violence of the machine. Because the Old West didn't just fade away, it was industrialized into a graveyard of mountain peaks and poisoned water. The mountains that vanished. The industrial death of the land. In the world of Bonanza, the Ponderosa is an eternal, unchanging paradise. The pine trees are always lush, the streams are always crystal clear, and the land itself feels like a divine gift that will last forever. In the Lone Ranger, the frontier is a vast, pristine wilderness, a stage where the hero can ride for days without seeing anything but untouched nature. Hollywood sold us the Wild West as a place of infinite resources and uncorrupted beauty. But while the Cartwrights were admiring the scenery, the real West was being subjected to the first modern industrial apocalypse. The land wasn't being settled, it was being liquefied. When you think of gold mining, you probably think of a lone prospector with a pan by a stream, like a character from a Disney movie. That image lasted about 6 months. By the 1860s, the pick and shovel era was dead, replaced by a terrifying piece of technology known as the monitor. Imagine a massive cast-iron water cannon, looking like a piece of heavy artillery from the Civil War. These machines were the ultimate weapons of the corporate West. They didn't mine the earth, they assaulted it. Using gravity-fed pipes that dropped water from thousands of feet above, the monitor created a jet of water so pressurized that it could kill a man instantly or move a boulder the size of a wagon. The Lone Ranger fought outlaws with silver bullets. The mining syndicates fought the mountains with 5,000 gallons of water per second. The process was called hydraulic mining, and it was the death of the Old West. These cannons were aimed at the sides of mountains, literally washing them away to get at the ancient gold-bearing gravel hidden deep inside. In a matter of days, a mountain that had stood for millions of years would be turned into a slurry of gray mud and debris. But the destruction didn't stay at the mine. All that slickens, the name for the massive volume of mud, sand, and rock, had to go somewhere. It flowed into the river systems, raising the riverbeds by dozens of feet. Imagine being a farmer in the Sacramento Valley. You've worked for years to build a life like the one you saw on Bonanza. Suddenly, your fields aren't growing crops. They're being buried under 10 feet of toxic mud. Your orchards are suffocated. Your home is flooded with a slurry that smells of sulfur and rot. Even worse was mercury. To catch the tiny flakes of gold, miners lined their sluice boxes with liquid mercury. Over the decades, an estimated 13 million pounds of mercury were dumped into the California watershed. It didn't wash away. It stayed in the soil, in the fish, and in the bones of the people who lived there. The pristine streams of the Lone Ranger were actually industrial sewers, carrying a poison that would last for centuries. This led to the first real environmental war in American history, the farmers versus the miners. In 1884, a landmark case known as Woodruff versus North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Co. finally reached a judge. The farmers argued that the corporate mines were destroying their livelihood. The mining companies, backed by the same corporate power we saw in Section 5, argued that progress required the destruction of the land. The farmers won, leading to the first major environmental injunction in the U.S., but the damage was already done. The Wild West was a landscape of scarred earth, vanished forests, and rivers that ran gray with the pulverized remains of the Sierras. The frontier wasn't tamed by the brave. It was strip-mined by the greedy. When you see the Cartwrights riding through the woods, remember that in the real West, those woods were often being cut down to fuel the steam engines and build the timber-shored tunnels of the industrial machine. The wilderness was a warehouse, and the heroism was a thin veneer over a society that was burning through its resources as fast as it could dig them up. But the death of the land was only the beginning, because as the mountains vanished, the very idea of the West began to dissolve. The government was about to make an announcement that would break the American heart and give birth to the Hollywood lie once and for all. The physical destruction of the land was complete, but the psychological destruction of the frontier was just beginning. It all came down to a single piece of paper and a government clerk in 1890. The death of a dream. The 1890 census and the national identity crisis. In the final scene of an episode of Bonanza, the Cartwrights usually ride back toward the ranch house as the sun sets. The music swells, the Ponderosa map burns onto the screen, and there is a profound sense of permanence. The ranch will always be there. The frontier will always be open. The horizon will always be waiting for the next generation of brave men. But in 1890, a government clerk sitting in a cramped wood-paneled office in Washington, D.C., picked up a pen and effectively killed the American soul. He was looking at the data from the 11th U.S. Census. For 100 years, the Census Bureau had tracked the frontier line, the jagged boundary where civilization met the untamed wilderness. They defined it as any area with fewer than 2 people per square mile. But as the clerk tallied the numbers from 1890, he realized something terrifying. There were no more gaps. The map was full. The frontier was officially closed. This wasn't just a statistical update. It sparked a massive, nationwide existential crisis. For a century, America had defined itself not by what it was, but by what it could be. The West was the safety valve of the nation. If you were poor in a New York tenement, if you were a failed businessman in Ohio, or if you just wanted to reinvent yourself, you could always go west. The Wild was the place where the American character was supposedly forged in the fires of rugged individualism. The Lone Ranger rode into the sunset because there was always more sunset to find. In 1890, the sunset hit a wall. This realization gave birth to the frontier thesis by historian Frederick Jackson Turner. He argued that the American identity, our democracy, our grit, our very nature, was a direct result of having a frontier to conquer. Without it, he feared we would become just like the stagnant societies of Europe, a nation of office workers, factory hands, and bureaucrats. But the physical death of the West had already happened 4 years earlier in a nightmare known as the Great Die-Up. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was a biblical catastrophe that Hollywood completely ignores. After years of corporate overgrazing, a brutal drought was followed by the most vicious winter in recorded history. Temperatures plummeted to minus 60 Fahrenheit. Blizzards buried the plains in feet of ice. The cattle, the very lifeblood of the Wild West, couldn't get to the grass. They died by the millions. When the snow melted in the spring of 1887, the reality was a landscape of horror. In some parts of Montana and Wyoming, you could literally walk for miles on the rotting carcasses of cattle without ever touching the ground. 90% of the herds were wiped out. The open range didn't just end, it froze to death. The wealthy cattle barons went bankrupt, the cowboys were fired, and the land was carved up by barbed wire to prevent such a disaster from ever happening again. The Wild West didn't fade away into a golden memory. It was liquidated in a single winter and then filed away in a government cabinet. This is the exact moment the Western myth was born. We didn't start making movies about cowboys because they were relevant. We started making them because they were gone. We created the legend of the Lone Ranger and the Cartwrights to fill the void left by the closure of the land. We turned the grit, the disease, the corporate greed, and the failed camel experiments into a clean, heroic fairy tale to convince ourselves that we were still those rugged individuals, even as we moved into high-rise apartments and assembly lines. The Wild West of Bonanza isn't a historical record. It's a funeral eulogy for a dream that died in the mud and the snow. If this journey through the real West has changed the way you look at history, I want to hear from you. Drop a truth in the comments if you're ready to see more myths dismantled. Your support is what keeps this channel digging, the sunset of the truth. So, why does the truth matter? Why should we care that the duels were clumsy, the lawmen were corrupt, and the Ponderosa was a lie? Because myths are dangerous when they replace history. When we celebrate the winning of the West, we are celebrating a process that was often cruel, chaotic, and environmentally disastrous. But within that truth, there is a much deeper respect to be found. The real people of the West, the black cowboys who found freedom in the saddle, the Chinese laborers who built the future, the pioneer women who survived the silence. Those people were far more heroic than any movie character. They didn't have a script. They only had the wind, the dirt, and the terrifying, beautiful silence of the plains. The Wild West is gone. The movies remain. But the next time you hear the whistle of a desert wind, remember, it wasn't a soundtrack. It was the sound of survivors.